We are the only creatures on Earth that wake up and decide to be something else. We drape ourselves in cotton, silk, and polyester. A second skin to replace the one we lost 2 million years ago. But the shirt you're wearing isn't just fashion. It's a fossil. It's the scar of a revolution that changed the world. Welcome to Before Memory. Today the topic we are going to discuss is the real reason humans started wearing clothes. It's not what you think. So let's get started. Somewhere on this earth, right now, there is an animal that does something no other creature in the history of life has ever done. Covers itself. Every single morning, without exception, before it eats, before it speaks, before it steps into the light of a new day, it wraps its body in the skin of something else. It does this not out of instinct, not because its genes demand it. It does this because something happened to it long ago, something so profound and so strange that it altered the very course of life on this planet. That animal is you. And the story of why you do this, the real story, not the simple one you were told in school, is one of the most breathtaking, unexpected, and deeply human mysteries ever unraveled by science. Most people, if you ask them, will give you the obvious answer. We started wearing clothes because we were cold, because we left Africa and walked into frozen landscapes and needed protection. It's logical, it's clean, and it is almost entirely wrong. The truth is stranger, older, more intimate, and by the time we reach the end of this journey, you will never look at the shirt on your back the same way again. Let us begin not with humans, but with a louse. A louse, one of the smallest, most reviled creatures on Earth. A parasite so tiny you need a magnifying glass to see it clearly. A creature that has lived in human hair for millions of years. And yet, it was this humble, ugly, almost invisible insect that gave scientists one of the most startling clues about the origins of human clothing. Stay with that thought. We will come back to it. Because before we can understand why humans put on clothes, we need to understand something far more unsettling. We need to understand why we took them off in the first place. Imagine yourself standing in the East African savanna 2 million years ago. The grass is golden. The sky is enormous. The heat is absolute. And moving through that landscape, barely visible against the shimmering horizon, is a creature unlike any that came before it. It stands upright. It walks on 2 legs. Its eyes are forward-facing and sharp, and it is almost completely, utterly naked. This is Homo ergaster or early Homo erectus, depending on which scientist you ask, and it represents one of the most dramatic biological transformations in the history of our lineage. Because just a few million years before this moment, our ancestors were covered in fur. Dense, dark, protective fur, like every other primate, like every other mammal on Earth. And then, slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, they lost it. Why? This is the question that haunts evolutionary biologists, and the answer they've arrived at is, in itself, a kind of miracle. The savanna 2 million years ago was not a gentle place. It was an arena, a crucible, a landscape where every calorie burned was a calorie that had to be won back from a world that was not interested in your survival. The predators were larger than today's. The competition was fiercer. The resources were scattered across vast, punishing distances. And into this world stepped our ancestors, abandoning the protective forests of their primate cousins, choosing instead to live in the open, under the full hammer of the tropical sun. For any mammal, this is a thermal crisis. The sun doesn't just warm you. At these latitudes, on this terrain, it cooks you. And a brain, which is an extraordinarily delicate, energy-hungry organ, is the first thing to suffer when your core temperature rises too high. Overheat your brain for even a few minutes and the consequences are catastrophic. The neurons begin to misfire. The body convulses. Death follows. Our ancestors, to survive this world, needed to solve a problem that no primate had ever faced. How do you cool a large brain in the direct sun, while running over long distances in pursuit of prey? The answer, it turned out, was to become naked. Dr. Nina Jablonski, a paleoanthropologist at Penn State University who has spent decades studying the evolution of human skin, describes it this way. The loss of body hair in our ancestors was not an accident of evolution. It was an engineering solution of extraordinary elegance. When you lose fur, you expose skin. And when you expose skin, you make sweating dramatically more efficient. Humans are, in the entire animal kingdom, among the most prodigious sweaters on Earth. We have between 2 and 5 million eccrine sweat glands covering our bodies, far more than any other primate, and they are capable of producing up to 1.5 liters of sweat per hour during intense activity. Sweat, as it evaporates, pulls heat out of the body with remarkable efficiency. It is, in essence, a biological air conditioning system, and without fur to trap moisture and prevent airflow, this system works at maximum capacity. This is why our ancestors could do something no other large predator on the African savanna could sustain. They could run. Not sprint. Our ancestors were not fast, but they could run for hours, days even. They could pursue prey across the open landscape until the animal, which could sprint brilliantly but couldn't sweat effectively enough to maintain body temperature over long distances, simply collapsed from heat exhaustion. This hunting strategy, called persistence hunting, is still practiced today by the San people of the Kalahari. They walk and jog after an antelope for hours, sometimes entire days, tracking it through the bush. The animal runs and rests, but the hunter never fully stops. And eventually, inevitably, the antelope simply overheats, and the hunter walks up to it and ends its suffering with a spear. This was the gift of nakedness. This was why we lost our fur. But here is where the story turns. Here is where it gets complicated and strange and beautiful, because the same nakedness that made us supreme hunters on the African savanna was also, eventually, going to nearly kill us somewhere else. For most of human prehistory, our story is an African story. We evolved there. We suffered there. We thrived there. We became, over 2 million slow, grinding years, something extraordinary there. But there is a restlessness in us, a compulsion to move, to look over the next ridge, across the next river, beyond the next horizon. Scientists call it dispersal, but perhaps a simpler word is better. Wandering. The first dispersals of Homo erectus out of Africa began perhaps 1.8 million years ago. These were not organized migrations. There was no plan, no destination, no awareness that a continent was being crossed. These were bands of 20, 30, perhaps 50 individuals following herds, following rivers, following instinct. Over thousands of generations, they spread across Eurasia. They reached the forests of Southeast Asia. They arrived on the shores of the Java Sea. They stood, perhaps, at the edge of the world they knew, and they looked out across the water. For most of this time, the world was warm enough. The Pleistocene epoch was punctuated by cycles of cold and warming ice ages that came and went in rhythms of roughly 100,000 years. But for much of this long early period, the climates that Homo erectus encountered were manageable. Harsh, yes, but not unsurvivable. Then, roughly 800,000 years ago, something shifted. The glacial cycles deepened. The cold became colder. The ice grew. And our ancestors, or their successors, by now evolving into new forms, found themselves in landscapes that the naked African ape was fundamentally, dangerously unprepared for. Picture a winter in Ice Age Europe 60,000 years ago. This is not winter as we know it in the temperate world today. This is a cold so profound it defies the modern imagination. Temperatures that routinely fell to -30, -40 degrees Celsius. A landscape of treeless tundra stretching to every horizon, swept by winds that carried ice crystals sharp as broken glass. Animals died by the thousands in these winters. Rivers froze solid for months. The ground itself was locked in permafrost for dozens of meters down. And into this landscape, walking out of the warmer south, came our ancestors. How? This is the question. If you are a naked primate evolved for the African savanna, built for heat, for sweat, for long sun-drenched runs across open grassland, how do you survive a northern winter that could kill you in hours of exposure? There is only one answer, and it is not a biological one. You cannot grow fur back. Evolution doesn't work that fast. Certainly not on the scale of a single human lifetime, or even 100 human lifetimes. But you have something your primate cousins don't. Something that no other animal on Earth possesses in the same form. You have a mind capable of culture. capable of learning from others, capable of taking an idea from your grandmother and passing it to your grandchildren. And somewhere, in some moment we will never precisely identify, in some cave or camp whose location is lost to us forever, a human mind had an idea. Take the skin of the animal. Wrap it around yourself. Survive the night. This sounds simple, obvious even, but stop for a moment and appreciate what it actually represents. Every other animal on Earth that survives cold weather does so through biology. The Arctic fox grows a thick winter coat. The polar bear has an insulating layer of blubber evolved over millions of years. The migration of birds is written into their genes before they hatch. These adaptations are biological. They are automatic. They require no conscious decision. But when the first human picked up an animal skin and wrapped it around their shoulders, they were doing something categorically different. They were using an external object to compensate for a biological limitation. They were, in a very real sense, extending their body beyond the boundaries of their skin. This is cultural adaptation, and it is one of the most uniquely human things that exists. The philosopher Andy Clark has a concept he calls the extended mind. The idea that human cognition doesn't stop at the boundary of our skull, but extends outward into the tools and objects we use. When we start thinking about the origins of clothing through this lens, something remarkable comes into focus. That first animal skin wasn't just protection from the cold. It was the first step in an ongoing project that humans have been engaged in ever since. The project of remaking the world to fit our needs, rather than remaking ourselves to fit the world. Every technology we have ever invented, from that first animal skin to the computer in your pocket, is a continuation of the same fundamental impulse. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because the story of where clothing actually begins, the physical, archaeological story, is older and stranger than most people realize. Remember the louse? The tiny, ugly, intimate parasite we mentioned at the very beginning? Here is where it becomes extraordinary. Human beings host two very closely related species of lice. The head louse, which lives in our scalp hair, and the body louse, which lives in our clothing. Now, these two species are genetically so similar that scientists can study when they diverged from each other, when the body louse split off from the head louse as a separate species. And since the body louse can only live in clothing, it needs the fabric to lay its eggs, to complete its life cycle. The moment when these two species separated is also, necessarily, the moment when humans began wearing enough clothing consistently enough for the body louse to evolve as a specialist. It is one of the most indirect and unexpected pieces of evidence in all of human evolutionary biology. We don't have the clothing itself. Organic materials degrade over tens of thousands of years, and almost nothing survives. We don't have the sewing needles, well, we have some, but they are relatively recent. What we have is a parasite, a creature so intertwined with our daily lives that it evolved a new species just to live in our clothes. And when scientists applied the molecular clock, the technique of calculating how long ago two species diverged, based on their genetic differences, to head lice and body lice, they arrived at a number, somewhere between 170,000 and 83,000 years ago. Think about what that means. Somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago, humans were wearing clothing consistently enough for a new species of louse to evolve and specialize. This is not someone occasionally grabbing an animal skin on a cold night. This is clothing as a regular feature of daily life. Clothing as something humans wore reliably enough, for long enough periods, that a parasite staked its entire evolutionary future on our wardrobes. This finding, published in a landmark study in 2003 and refined by subsequent analyses, pushed the origins of human clothing back far further than the archaeological record alone had suggested. And it raised an immediate, burning question. What was happening 100,000 to 170,000 years ago that would make clothing a necessity? The answer lies in ice. 115,000 years ago, the Earth entered a glacial period, an ice age, that would last until approximately 11,000 years ago, reaching its most extreme phase around 20,000 years ago. This was the period known to scientists as the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered northern Europe, northern Asia, and vast swaths of North America. Sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters as water was locked up in glaciers. The Sahara, today a desert, was even drier and more inhospitable than it is now. Much of Africa itself was colder and drier. But here is the crucial detail that often gets lost in discussions of the Ice Age. It wasn't just the northern latitudes that were affected. Even in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, regions we think of as warm today, temperatures during the Ice Age could fall dramatically, especially at altitude and during winter months. There are archaeological sites in southern Africa, places like Blombos Cave and Pinnacle Point, that show anatomically modern humans living through some of the worst of these conditions, and doing so with an increasing toolkit of sophisticated behaviors and technologies. Clothing was almost certainly part of that toolkit, not just for warmth, but, and here is where the story opens into an entirely unexpected territory, for something altogether more complex. We have talked about cold. We have talked about ice and distance and the thermal demands of survival in harsh climates. This is the standard narrative. This is what the textbooks say when they bother to address the question at all. But there is a second reason why humans started wearing clothes. A reason that is actually, in some ways, more important than warmth. A reason that goes to the very heart of what it means to be human. And to understand it, we need to talk about something uncomfortable. Something we rarely discuss directly, even though it shapes almost every aspect of how we live. We need to talk about nakedness itself. What it means, what it does to a group of social animals, and what covering the body does to those same animals. Social primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, baboons are naked or nearly so. They do not experience nudity as we do. For them, there is no shame, no vulnerability, no particular social meaning attached to the exposed body. Sexual signaling exists, certainly, displays of dominance, fertility, readiness, but these are largely instinctive and tied to specific behaviors and physical features, not to the general visibility of the body. But somewhere in our lineage, something changed. Something subtle, cognitive, and profound. Humans began to develop what psychologists call self-awareness. The capacity to see ourselves as others see us. To understand that we are being observed. To model in our minds what another person is perceiving when they look at us. This capacity, this extraordinary mental trick, is what makes human social life possible. It's what enables empathy. It's what drives language and art and culture. But it also necessarily changes the experience of being seen. When you know you are being observed, your body is no longer just your body. It becomes a social object, a text that others are reading, a statement being made whether you intend it or not. And once the human body became a social object, once nakedness acquired social meaning, covering or uncovering it became a powerful act. An act of communication, an act of identity, an act of power. The anthropologist Daniel Miller, who has spent his career studying material culture, the objects humans make and use, argues that clothing is fundamentally about self-making. When we dress, he has written, we are constructing a version of ourselves that we then present to the world. The clothing is not just covering the body. It is creating a social persona. It is making a claim about who we are, what group we belong to, what values we hold, what status we have achieved. And this social dimension of clothing may, in fact, be older than its purely utilitarian dimension. Consider this, the evidence we have for early human use of pigments and ochre, for the deliberate decoration of the body, goes back at least 100,000 years at Blombos Cave. The shells used as beads at that same site, strung as personal ornaments, date to at least 77,000 years ago. These are forms of body adornment. They are not functional in any thermal sense. They are communicative. They are social. It is entirely plausible, many researchers now believe it is likely, that the drive to adorn and mark the body preceded, or at minimum ran parallel to, the drive to cover it for warmth. That the first animal skins draped across human shoulders were not primarily about heat retention, but about something else. Distinction, identity, belonging. Think about what clothing allows a social group to do. It allows members to signal their affiliation, to say, without speaking, I am one of you. It allows individuals to signal their status, to say, without speaking, I have achieved this rank, or I hold this role. It allows people to signal their readiness and intention, to say, without speaking, I am a hunter, a healer, a chief, an elder. In a world without writing, Without the ability to record information in permanent form, the body itself was the canvas on which social information was inscribed. Clothing was part of that inscription, and there is evidence, ancient, fragmentary, but real, that this is precisely how early humans thought about it. The oldest known use of animal skins for clothing in the archaeological record is not straightforwardly about warmth. The sites where we find the earliest clear evidence of hide processing, the use of stone scrapers to clean and prepare animal skins, found at Neanderthal and early modern human sites across Africa and Europe, often occur in contexts where the environmental temperature, while perhaps cooler than today, was not desperately cold. These were not Arctic survival situations. These were people who had other options, which suggests that the decision to wear skins, to cover the body deliberately, was motivated by something beyond mere thermal necessity. Let us stay with the Neanderthals for a moment because they complicate the story in a fascinating way. Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary cousins, who lived across Europe and Western Asia from roughly 400,000 years ago until their extinction or absorption into our population around 40,000 years ago, also processed animal hides. They had stone tools clearly shaped for scraping skins. They lived through some of the most brutal Ice Age conditions in human evolutionary history. By any straightforward thermal logic, they should have been wearing a lot of clothing. And yet the evidence suggests their clothing, while certainly present, may have been simpler than ours. Less tailored, less fitted, less technologically sophisticated. A 2020 study analyzing the animal bones at Neanderthal sites found patterns of hide removal and processing, but also noted that Neanderthals seemed to favor large-bodied animals whose skins could be used as simple wraps or drapes, rather than the smaller, more intricate pelts that early modern humans began favoring as they developed more sophisticated sewing technologies. Sewing. That word is important, because the development of tailored, fitted clothing that was cut and shaped and stitched to conform to the body, represents a technological and cognitive leap that goes well beyond simply picking up an animal skin and draping it over your shoulders. Fitted clothing is clothing that was designed, planned, imagined before it existed, and the tools that enable fitted clothing, needles, awls, thread, tell us something extraordinary about the minds that made them. The oldest known sewing needles in the archaeological record are approximately 50,000 years old, found at sites associated with Denisovan populations in Siberia's Altai Mountains. The Denisovans, a mysterious human group known primarily from fragmentary DNA evidence recovered from just a handful of ancient bones, were making delicate, polished bone needles with drilled eyes capable of threading sinew long before the most dramatic expansions of modern Homo sapiens. The modern human sewing needles follow shortly after in sites across northern Eurasia, and they are among the most startling objects in the entire archaeological record. Not because of their size, they are tiny, often barely 4 or 5 centimeters long, but because of what they represent. To make a bone needle requires a sequence of steps that is, by any measure, cognitively demanding. You must select the right piece of bone, dense, strong, capable of taking a fine edge without shattering. You must split it into a thin sliver with controlled pressure. You must grind and smooth it into a rounded, tapered shape. You must drill a tiny hole, the eye at the blunt end, a task requiring both fine motor precision and the right drilling tool. And you must do all of this while holding in your mind a clear image of what you are making and why. This is not improvisation. This is engineering. It is forethought made physical. It is the same basic cognitive operation that underlies every complex human technology, from the wheel to the microchip. And the purpose of all this effort? To stitch pieces of animal hide together so that the resulting garment would fit the body closely, trapping air next to the skin and dramatically improving its thermal insulation. The people who made these needles were not just surviving the Ice Age. They were solving it. The thermal physics of well-fitted clothing are, in fact, remarkable. A loosely draped animal skin, the kind you might create without sewing, can provide meaningful insulation, but it allows cold air to circulate freely at the openings. When you move, the skin shifts, exposing gaps. Wind penetrates easily. On a still, moderately cold night, it might be adequate. In a blizzard, on the move, it might get you killed. A well-tailored fur garment, by contrast, one with fitted sleeves, a hood that can be pulled tight, overlapping layers at the chest, legs covered to the ankle, creates a sealed microenvironment next to the skin. The air trapped within this space is warmed by body heat and held there. This is the same principle behind modern down jackets and thermal undergarments. And it is so effective that people wearing it can survive temperatures that would be rapidly lethal to an unprotected naked human. The Arctic peoples who have lived at extreme northern latitudes for thousands of years, the Inuit, the Yupik, the various Siberian peoples, have developed clothing systems of extraordinary sophistication that exploit this physics to its limit. Multiple layered garments, each serving a specific thermal function. Boots lined with grass for insulation from frozen ground. Mittens with separate inner liners that can be removed for fine motor work. Hoods with precise geometries shaped to minimize heat loss from the face while maintaining adequate ventilation. These are not merely practical garments. They are the product of millennia of engineering refinement, of grandmothers teaching daughters teaching granddaughters the exact way to cut a seam, the precise angle at which a hood must be set to work correctly in a blizzard, the right species of bird whose down provides the best insulation for the innermost layer. This is knowledge encoded not in genes, but in culture, passed not through biology, but through teaching, and it represents, in miniature, the entire project of human civilization. But let us pull back from the technical for a moment, because there is something else happening in the development of clothing that deserves our full attention. Something that the archaeologists can see faintly in the record, and that once you see it, you cannot unsee. Clothing was becoming art. At Sungur, in Russia, there is an extraordinary archaeological site dating to roughly 34,000 years ago. Here, archaeologists discovered the burials of several individuals, including 2 children buried head to head in a single grave, whose clothing at the time of death was adorned with thousands of ivory beads. The beads were made from mammoth tusk, each one carefully carved and perforated. They were sewn onto garments in patterns that must have been visually striking, rows and bands and geometric arrangements that covered the clothing from collar to boot. To produce the beads for a single burial at Sungur, researchers estimate, would have required thousands of hours of labor. This was not practical ornamentation. This was not something added for warmth or weather protection. This was beauty, status, ceremony. These people were being buried in their finest clothes, and their finest clothes were extraordinary. At 34,000 years ago, clothing was already a language, a system of signs and symbols communicating things that words alone could not convey. Let us zoom out again. Let us take the long view. Across the past 100,000 years of human prehistory, something fascinating happens to clothing. It begins as warmth. It becomes identity. And then, slowly, in the same way that language accumulates grammar and literature accumulates genre, it becomes something almost impossibly complex. Every human culture that has ever existed has had clothing or body decoration or both, without exception. This is one of the most remarkable regularities in the entire anthropological record. Cultures differ enormously in their cosmologies, their kinship structures, their economic systems, their religions, their art. But they all dress. The anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, writing in the early 20th century, observed that clothing seems to follow patterns, that styles shift in cycles, that hemlines rise and fall, that silhouettes expand and contract, in ways that suggest clothing is not merely a response to practical needs but is operating according to its own cultural logic. A logic of fashion that is, in some deep sense, independent of function. Why? Why would beings who evolved the capacity to clothe themselves for warmth spend such an enormous proportion of their creative energy making clothing that communicates, that signals, that places them within social hierarchies and group identities? Part of the answer lies in the nature of human social life itself. We are, among all the social animals on Earth, unusual in the degree to which our societies are built around individuals who are not genetically related to each other. Chimpanzee social groups are primarily kin groups, extended families. Wolves live in family packs. Elephants in matriarchal family units. But human beings have, for tens of thousands of years, lived in groups that include many individuals with no close genetic relationship to each other. This creates a problem. How do you maintain cooperation, trust, and social cohesion among individuals who don't share genes? How do you build the kind of large-scale, coordinated social organization that makes complex cultures possible? Part of the answer is language. Part of it is shared ritual and belief. Part of it is economic exchange. And part of it, a larger part than we usually acknowledge, is shared material culture. Shared objects, shared styles, including shared clothing. When you and I wear similar garments, when we share a style, a color, a symbol, a way of dressing, we are making a claim about our shared identity. We are signaling membership in the same tribe, the same community, the same moral universe. We are saying, without words, I am like you. This is not trivial. In a world where the greatest threat to an early human individual was not predators but other human groups, where raids, conflict, and intergroup violence were constant features of prehistoric life, the ability to quickly, reliably identify who was in your group and who was not was a matter of life and death. Clothing was a flag, a declaration, a warning system, and this social function of clothing may actually go deeper than its warmth function in terms of its evolutionary importance. Consider the experiments conducted by researchers studying what psychologists call enclothed cognition, the finding that the clothes we wear don't just communicate something to others about us. They also change how we think and behave ourselves. In a famous series of experiments, researchers found that participants who wore a doctor's coat performed significantly better on attention and cognitive tasks than participants wearing their regular clothes or wearing the same coat but told it was a painter's smock. The physical garment was identical. The only difference was what the wearers believed it meant. The clothes changed their minds. This is a strange and beautiful thing. We think of our minds as inside us, as enclosed within our skulls, separate from the world. But the clothes on our bodies, it turns out, reach inward as well as outward. They shape our behavior. They influence our cognition. They help construct the self that inhabits them. And perhaps this was always true. Perhaps from the very first time a human being picked up an animal skin and wrapped it around their shoulders, they felt something shift. Not just in their temperature, not just in how others looked at them, but in how they felt about themselves. Protected, defined, real. 11,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. The glaciers retreated. Sea levels rose. The vast grasslands that had covered parts of Europe and Asia began to give way to forests and wetlands. And the human beings who had survived 30,000 years of ice age conditions, who had made it through by means of their intelligence, their social organization, and their clothing, began to change in ways that would accelerate everything. They began to farm. The agricultural revolution is usually presented as a story about food, about the shift from hunting and gathering to growing crops and herding animals. And it was that. But it was also, inevitably, a story about clothing. Because farming meant surplus. And surplus meant trade. And trade meant that clothing, which had previously been made by the people who wore it, from the animals they hunted, could now be made by specialists and exchanged for other goods. The loom appears in the archaeological record roughly 27,000 years ago in its most primitive form, impressions of woven plant fibers found in clay at sites in the Czech Republic. But it is with the Neolithic, the age of farming that began roughly 10,000 years ago, that textile production truly begins to emerge as a major human technology. Flax, cultivated and processed into linen in the Nile Valley. Wool, harvested from domesticated sheep in the Middle East. Cotton, grown and spun in the Indus Valley civilization. These were not merely fibers. They were the beginning of global trade networks. They were the foundation of economies. They were, in a very real sense, the seed of civilization itself. The city of Ur, in ancient Mesopotamia, had a textile industry that employed hundreds of workers, mostly women, weaving wool into fabric that was then distributed through palace bureaucracies and traded across the ancient world. The records of this industry survive on cuneiform tablets, thousands of them, detailing weights of wool received, quantities of fabric produced, rations paid to workers. This is bureaucracy in the service of clothing, administration, record-keeping, tax, all generated by the human need to clothe itself. The Silk Road, that great network of trade routes connecting China to Rome, across the deserts of Central Asia and the mountains of the Caucasus, was, at its core, a road built by silk, by cloth, by the extraordinary human desire to possess a fabric so fine and lustrous that it seemed almost supernatural to those encountering it for the first time. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, complained bitterly about the enormous quantities of gold flowing eastward from Rome in exchange for Chinese silk. He calculated the cost of this trade to the Roman economy and was appalled. But the Romans kept buying, because silk was not just warm and comfortable. It was beautiful. It communicated wealth and status in a way that nothing else could. Clothing had become currency, power, politics, and it would remain so across every civilization, in every corner of the world, for thousands of years. In feudal Japan, the type and color of fabric you were permitted to wear was strictly regulated by law, sumptuary laws that encoded the entire social hierarchy in textile form. The aristocracy wore silk. The merchants and artisans wore linen and hemp. The lowest classes wore rough cotton or bark cloth. To wear above your station was a crime. To dress in the fabric of a higher class was, in a very literal sense, to impersonate that class, to make a false claim about your identity. In medieval Europe, similar laws governed who could wear fur and what type. Ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat, was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. To wear it without the right to do so was punishable offense. Purple, which required the laborious extraction of dye from thousands of sea snails, was so expensive to produce that it became synonymous with imperial power. The phrase "born to the purple" referred to children born into the royal household, literally surrounded by the color from birth. Color, fabric, cut, length, embroidery. All of these were carefully policed, socially enforced signals in a vast language of status and power. And what of those who subverted these codes? What of those who wore the wrong cloth, the wrong color, the wrong cut? They were making a statement, and sometimes that statement was revolutionary. The Indian independence movement of the 20th century had many weapons: ahimsa, non-violence; boycott, civil disobedience; and a spinning wheel. Mahatma Gandhi, one of the most politically sophisticated minds of the modern era, understood with absolute clarity that British colonialism in India was sustained, in part, by the destruction of India's indigenous textile industry. British manufacturers imported raw cotton from India, processed it in the mills of Manchester and Birmingham, and sold the finished cloth back to Indian consumers. This arrangement destroyed the livelihoods of millions of Indian weavers and kept India economically dependent on Britain. Gandhi's response was the khadi movement. He called upon every Indian to spin their own thread and weave their own cloth, khadi, and to refuse to buy British fabric. He himself spun thread daily, for the rest of his life. The spinning wheel became the symbol of the independence movement. It appeared on the flag of the Indian National Congress. This was a revolutionary act enacted through clothing, through the deliberate, politically conscious choice of what fabric to wear and who had produced it. And it worked, not entirely on its own, of course. But the khadi movement was a powerful economic and symbolic weapon in the dismantling of the British Empire. Clothing has always been this, a tool of power, and a tool of resistance to power. The Black Panther Party in 1960s America chose their uniform with extraordinary deliberate care. Black leather jackets, black berets, blue shirts. The visual impact was immediate and intentional. It communicated discipline, solidarity, resistance, and, most importantly, power. In a society that had spent centuries using clothing to mark Black Americans as subordinate, as workers, as servants, the Panthers used clothing to assert something entirely different: dignity, agency, defiance. The tuxedo, today a symbol of formal establishment elegance, was, when it was first introduced in the 1880s, considered scandalously informal. The men who wore it to events that called for white tie were making a statement about the rigidity of Victorian social codes. Fashion, in this reading, is a constant negotiation between conformity and rebellion, between the desire to belong and the desire to be seen as an individual. Every generation rewrites the dress code. Every generation uses clothing to declare something about who they are and what they refuse to be. This is not a modern phenomenon. It is not a product of consumer culture or mass media. It goes back, all the way back, to the bone needle and the ivory bead and the Sungur burial 34,000 years ago. It goes back, in some form, to the very first human who picked up an animal skin and felt something shift. We are now in the present, or close enough to it. The global fashion industry today is worth approximately $2.5 trillion annually. It employs hundreds of millions of people. It produces more than 100 billion garments per year, roughly 13 items of clothing for every person on Earth. It is one of the most significant industries in the global economy, and one of the most environmentally damaging, responsible for roughly 10% of global carbon emissions and massive water pollution from textile dyeing. The scale of this is almost incomprehensible. 100 billion garments, each one the product of a supply chain that stretches from cotton field to spinning mill to weaving factory, to dyeing plant to cutting room to sewing floor to shipping container to distribution center to retail store to your wardrobe. Each one, ultimately, a continuation of something that began on a cold night in the Pleistocene, when a human being had an idea. But here is what I want you to hold in your mind as we approach the end of this story. The human relationship with clothing is not simply a story about keeping warm. It is not simply a story about technology or economics or fashion or politics, though it is all of those things. It is a story about identity, about the extraordinary human need to make the self visible, to project into the world a version of who we are, or who we want to be, or who we are afraid of being. This need is so deep, so fundamental, so intertwined with the very structures of human consciousness and social life, that it may be as old as consciousness itself. There is a passage in Genesis, the creation story of the Abrahamic traditions, that has always struck scholars as deeply interesting. After Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit and gain knowledge, the first thing they do is notice that they are naked, and they cover themselves with fig leaves. The gaining of knowledge and the covering of the body are presented as simultaneous events, two faces of the same transformation. This is not, of course, a historical account. It is a myth, a profound cultural story encoding deep truths in narrative form. But the insight embedded in it is striking. The moment of self-awareness, the moment of seeing yourself as others see you, is inseparable from the moment of covering yourself. To know you are being seen is to want to control what is seen. And this, perhaps, is the deepest answer to the question we began with. Why did humans start wearing clothes? Because they became aware. Because they looked at themselves and at each other and realized that the body was not just a body, that it was a statement, a text, a message, and they wanted to be the ones writing it. You woke up this morning and you got dressed. You may have done it quickly, without much thought, a practiced sequence of motions so habitual as to be nearly automatic. Or you may have taken time, standing in front of a wardrobe, making choices with care, aware of what the day required and who you were going to encounter and what you wanted them to understand about you. Either way, you participated in one of the oldest continuous human behaviors on Earth. You performed a ritual that connects you, in an unbroken chain, to the Sungir burial 34,000 years ago, to the bone needle makers of Siberia 50,000 years ago, to the first human, perhaps 150,000 years ago, who felt the chill of a changing world and reached for an animal skin not merely to survive, but to express something, to mark the boundary between self and environment, between inside and outside, between who they were and who the world was. The clothes you wear today are made from materials and by processes that would be utterly incomprehensible to those earliest dressers. Synthetic fibers spun from petroleum, dyes derived from chemical synthesis, global supply chains of staggering complexity. And yet the fundamental act, the covering and adorning of the human body to communicate something to the world, is identical. You are wearing the inheritance of 2 million years of evolution, 150,000 years of cultural development, and 10,000 years of civilizational complexity. Every morning, without quite realizing it, you are making history. The louse, that humble parasite, gave us a clock. The bone needle gave us a window. The ivory beads of Sungir gave us a mirror. And together, they have given us something remarkable. A glimpse into the moment when we became not just intelligent, not just social, not just tool-using, but fully, unmistakably, irreversibly human. The moment we decided that the body was not enough, that we would add to it, extend it, adorn it, shape it, cover it, reveal it, and in doing so, make it speak. Every piece of clothing ever made is a sentence in that language. A language that began not in words, but in skins and beads and bone needles. A language that has never, in all the tens of thousands of years since, fallen silent. It is speaking right now, on your back, on your shoulders, in the choices you made this morning without fully understanding why. And now, perhaps you do. Because I think it is the most important of all. We have talked about cold and survival and social signaling and fashion and revolution and industry. We have traced the thread from the African savanna to the Ice Age to ancient Mesopotamia to the spinning wheel to the global supply chain. But underneath all of it, underneath every explanation, every theory, every data point and archaeological discovery and genetic study, there is a question that science can approach but never quite answer. Why does it matter to us? Why does it matter, not just practically but emotionally, what we wear? Why do people feel vulnerable when asked to undress in a clinical context, even when there is no physical threat? Why does a uniform make a person stand differently, speak differently, feel differently about themselves? Why do we keep old clothes that belong to people we loved, even when they are worn out and useless, as if the fabric had somehow absorbed something of the person? These are not thermal questions. They are not evolutionary questions, exactly, though evolution created the minds that ask them. They are questions about meaning, about the strange, fragile, miraculous business of being a self in a world full of other selves. Clothes are not just clothes. They never have been. They are the outward expression of the inward life. They are the first act of self-creation that every human being performs each day. They are the evidence that we do not simply live in the world, but that we interpret it, narrate it, and participate in it as conscious, meaning-making creatures. That is what the louse knew, what the bone needle understood, what the ivory beads at Sungur declared, in the silence of a grave 34,000 years deep. We are the animals that dress, and in dressing we announce, every single morning, that we are here, that we see and are seen, that we choose, that we matter. The first human who wrapped an animal skin around their shoulders on a cold night somewhere in prehistoric Africa or Eurasia wasn't just keeping warm. They were, for the first time, becoming themselves. And we have never stopped.